All right. Hello, everybody. This is called Cabin Fever Reliever. This is our little online sessions, workshops, discussions in the winter. Since it's usually snowy here in Minnesota, we'd like to have some online programming for our group called Art to Change the World. We are an art collective, nonprofit, and we rely on donations and memberships. And our mission is to pay artists, build community, and do art for positive social change. So I met Scott through his wife Dawn when I was studying poetry with Dawn. And Scott just seems to know everything about every battle and war there ever was. And he ended up writing this book that I thought would be so cool for him to share with us and how it relates to social justice and art. So,
Oh,
Scott,
come on.
introduce yourself and take it away.
Hi, I'm Scott, and I also tried to do some art for this presentation. Um, I don't like draw stuff, but I like to do calligraphy a lot, so I put this together. Um, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to let me speak to you today. I realize we've only got an hour, and I could talk about Joan of Arc for the rest of the night, so I'm going to actually try to use a script to keep me on time and keep me focused. Otherwise, I'll start dovetailing all over the place. Um, I'm going to jump around a bit, but I promise to bring all this together into the general theme that Kelly and I cooked up, which is Joan of Arc inspiring art, writing, and the women's suffrage movement. We're going to cover a lot of history and we're going to look at a lot of art. But I do want to start by saying that I love the theme of these sessions of cabin fever reliever. After the lengthy pandemic, it's easy to get in a rut. And I always like to point to Joan of Arc, who lasted 5 months in captivity before she threw herself out of a window. And I'm kind of joking as she was trying to escape. But she made it 5 months in seclusion, where some of us had to last years. So it can really wear on us. By the way, Joan survived this fall. We'll talk more about that later um, when we return to her story. But I should probably share some of my credentials. Kelly mentioned my book on Joan of Arc. I've also published 4 peer-reviewed essays on Joan of Arc, as well as others. I just recently had a fifth accepted for publication next year. And I also recently co-edited a book on medieval film with Kevin J. Hardy. He teaches at LaSalle in Philadelphia. One of the essays on that book is by Gail Orgelfinger. She talks about Joan of Arc films, so there's more Joan of Arc stuff if you're interested. And I've also had the privilege of taking part in organizing panels for the Joan of Arc Society for the past 5 or 6 years at the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is a little closer to home for some of y'all, I believe. Now, that's the stuff you put on a CV. I want to get a little personal with y'all. I'm of the firm belief that everyone at some point in their lives should have a healthy obsession with Joan of Arc. This obsession could be spiritual, inspirational, or historical in nature, but it is worth spending sleepless nights pondering the story of Joan of Arc. For some of us, that obsession may last a few days, and for others, years. For the women who fought for suffrage, glimpses of this inspiration from Joan of Arc began as early as the mid 1800s. And I'll get to the suffragists, but I want to emphasize that the world's obsession with Joan of Arc began in her lifetime and has proliferated for nearly 600 years since her death. I'm going to attempt to share some glimpses of what that obsession has been like in art and words. But let me start by making a statement. No one owns the story of Joan of Arc. Not the church, not France, not historians. We all have access to the same massive medieval record, much of it in Latin, but also in Middle French and other languages. And anyone who will tell you they are providing you with a singular Joan of Arc is either lying or they're deceived themselves. The bulk of the contemporary work on Joan of Arc was recorded by her detractors. Even though they recorded her words, it was filtered through their pen and in Latin. Then the bulk of the work on Joan of Arc a few decades later was recorded by a different group of people who wanted to sanctify her. It's two very extreme perspectives on the same person. And those two perspectives have merged together along with centuries of interpretations across different cultures to give us all the flavors we encounter of Joan today. As a result, we often see some very different versions of Joan of Arc. Now, let me give you some examples. First, there is the Joan the Pious Girl, who wanted to continue her designated women's work on her father's farm. This painting is depicting Joan's story that in her early teenage years, she began hearing voices from saints who first instructed her to be a good Christian, but then eventually instructed her to seek out the King of France and join the war against the English. She had no desire for military glory, and she only left to join the war out of necessity and divine instruction. This painting's on display at the Met. Joan has stepped away from spinning thread and appears to be contemplating the latest message she just received from the saints in the background. Second, we move from the pious Joan to the militant Joan. This is the Joan that instigated the charge at Patay, where the English were caught unprepared and suffered around 2,500 casualties. While many of the eyewitnesses attest that she urged the charge, they all agree she was not physically in front. Joan instead arrived in a second wave. However, there were battles where eyewitnesses attested to Joan leading the charges. She was even captured leading such a charge. The important part is the spirit of this painting, which is that of a teenage warrior leading, and it is a far cry from spinning thread on a farm. These paintings are huge, by the way. I am a normal-sized human male, and I could use this painting to cover my car. But these are just two versions of Joan. There's the pious farm girl, the militant warrior. And even my interpretations that I just gave you of these paintings are up for debate. Joan on the left can be seen as reckoning with her destiny, and Joan on the right can even be seen as in over her head when you look at her face. My point is that there are many versions of Joan, and people emphasize that they believe what she would and would not do in specific situations. However, what I try to impart to folks is that Joan's story and her circumstances are so unique that for me, it is far more fascinating to understand how Joan of Arc carved a path for herself in a medieval world that did not provide any avenue whatsoever for girls, especially those outside the noble class. Well, let's talk about this path that Joan carved. And I'm going to give you all a primer on her life, and we're going to do it through some Victorian art. In 1428, during what we now call the Hundred Years' War, Joan arrived on the scene in the frontier of Lorraine, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, claiming to hear instructions from divine voices that she must lead the armies of Charles VII in order to expel the English from France and see him properly crowned at Rheims, where French kings had been traditionally crowned. After spending months convincing a local captain of her mission, she trekked through enemy territory dressed as a man so as to avoid suspicion. She would never wear women's clothing again after that until her death. She eventually met with the king to promote her mission. Although he was compelled, the king had theologians examine and question her for 11 days. The theologians could not find evidence of evil in her. When they asked for some sign from God, Joan said she would lift the siege of Orleans. They recommended the king send her to the siege to see what would happen. Joan is 17 years old at this point, and this is where I like to do a thought exercise with folks. I don't know how many of you work in an office building and things like that, but I try to tell like coworkers, imagine you go into the lobby and there's a teenager who tells you they have a plan for the company that will see it successful and defeat its competitors. And they got the idea from God, and they just need you to broker a meeting with the CEO. Would you help broker that meeting, or would you perhaps call security or try to find their parents? Like that's what you try to think of when you hear these stories. But they sent Joan to Orleans. After she arrived there, the defending French celebrated their biggest successes and eventual victory against the English, who had sustained that siege for more than 7 months. These frescoes are huge, by the way. That's me down there in the corner, losing my religion. Sorry, that just came out. That's not in the script. The king's army then captured more English-controlled cities along the Loire River before marching to Rheims, bringing more cities over to the king's side, often without even firing a shot. At Rheims, Charles was coronated. Joan was present in armor with her standard in hand. The success of Joan's campaigning stalled outside the gates of Paris, where she was wounded, And then the rest of her military career was spent fighting mercenaries and Burgundians, not the English, until she was captured trying to lift the siege of Compiègne. Joan then spent more than a year in captivity, the final 4 months of which were spent in an Inquisition trial. She was grilled in public in her cell, threatened with torture and excommunication. This painting depicts the Cardinal of Winchester, who we know was responsible for securing part of Joan's ransom when she was captured. He did not participate directly in her trial, but he's often depicted working behind the scenes. The trial ended with her committing to never wear men's clothing again, nor claim she was talking to saints. A few days later, on May 30th, 1431, Joan violated both of these mandates. She was condemned as a relapsed heretic and executed later that day. 25 years later, a second trial was hosted in France, featuring eyewitness testimony from those who encountered Joan, resulting in a nullification of the Inquisition trial's verdict. Now, there are plenty of things to nitpick about some of these images that I've shared so far, and I've mentioned a few of them. For example, the pyre that Joan is on here was placed much higher than what's depicted in this painting. But what I've done, without you perhaps realizing, is expose you to some of the same images of Joan of Arc that were prevalent during the early 20th century suffragist movements. But we'll get back to that. I want to keep talking about Joan. I tend to think of things in stats and numbers. And I put the next few slides together because when I was working on a military history degree, I was struck by how there were so many stats for every historical military commander, but not for Joan. Historians have seemingly relished calculating how many miles Alexander the Great or Caesar marched in such and such campaign. Yet Joan's often depicted as this anomaly, and then debates center on whether she had any military acumen at all or if she was just some inspirational symbol. The spoiler, she was both. But when I put together the stats in her career, which was brief, I realized how easily this measured up to any other military figure we like to study. Okay, now it's time for some show and tell. So the English King Henry VI, or his representatives, he was very young at the time, so they paid 10,000 francs for Joan after she was captured. In medieval warfare, fortunes were made by capturing the right nobleman and ransoming his freedom. However, the king had the option at this time to buy any prisoner among his troops for a set price, and this was 10,000 francs. This is a significant sum of money, and here's how I'll demonstrate that. In my hands, and I hope this comes up, I have a blanc, and this is a blanc of Charles VII. And I took a picture in case you can't see this very well. I'm going to try to, I don't know if it's coming out, but one side's got a cross and another side's got some fleur-de-lis on it. This is a blanc. This was stamped during Joan's lifetime or shortly afterward. And a blanc was roughly 3 ounces in weight with a fineness of about 50% of silver during this time. And they're always, give and take a little bit. They're not precise in their measurements. And there were roughly 24 of these blancs in a franc. And I don't own a franc because I'm not made of money. Now, 10,000 francs would equate to 240,000 blancs, which would equate to roughly 360 ounces of silver. And when I checked silver prices last week, an ounce was going for $29, which would bring Joan of Arc's ransom to just under 10.5 million US dollars. Joan of Arc came onto the scene like a wildfire. She was unlike anyone encountered before. The nobles, the clergy, the soldiers were all enamored with her. They very often did not know what to do in her presence, but Joan very often got her way. Still, she was not without her detractors, both French and English, and the English were willing to pay literally a king's ransom to hold her in captivity, and the University of Paris and its theologians wanted to see her tried for heresy. And all of this has resulted in a series of seemingly hyperbolic statements that I'm going to make, but they're all true. First, Joan of Arc is the most documented person in the Middle Ages. What I mean by that, there is no other medieval figure that had more written about them during their lifetime than Joan of Arc. That includes all the kings, the emperors, Charlemagne, all of them. There's more surviving documents and eyewitness accounts on Joan of Arc than any of them. In addition, Joan of Arc participated in the Siege of Orleans, the most documented siege of the Middle Ages. And there are plenty of sieges you might expect more, but Orleans has more documentation than the sieges of Constantinople or Jerusalem. And finally, Joan of Arc defended herself in the most documented trial of the Middle Ages, her Inquisition trial. In one of history's greatest ironies, the assessors of Joan wanted to ensure that their judgment was considered by everyone correct and above board, so they followed strict processes, documented every discussion, and produced 5 copies of the trial in Latin. And this trial lasted nearly 5 months. In the transcripts, there's even indication at times when Joan is being paraphrased or quoted word for word. In their zeal for this process and to appear above board, these men who tried Joan ensured that her words have made it down to us today. So, just to reiterate, Joan of Arc is the most documented person in the Middle Ages, participated in the most documented siege, and defended herself in the most documented trial. And after Joan's execution, the obsession with her did not subside. Many of the men who participated in her trial, and there was 130 plus of them, then traveled to church councils throughout the continent and shared their accounts with others. Discussion of her continued for years and then centuries, and today material on Joan in words and art is overwhelming, and it's impossible to quantify, but I'm going to give it a shot. To do that, we need to take a trip to the Boston Public Library, which houses the Joan of Arc collection originally curated by the late Cardinal John Joseph Wright. Wright grew up in Boston and tells us his interest in Joan of Arc started in the 6th grade, where he began collecting any and everything he could find on her. And his roughly 500 unique pieces include paintings, sculptures, etchings, engravings, bells, pins, coins, clocks, spoons, tapestries, wood carvings, dolls, and more, all depicting Joan of Arc. And he also collected roughly 6,000 books and manuscripts in any language from any period. There are documents in his collection dating back to the 15th century. It's a legitimate archive. And just look at some of the stuff he found. Here's an ivory triptych depicting Joan of Arc entering Orleans on horseback. This thing folds up, fit in your pocket, and take it for wherever you're going. And then it's next to this bronze statue of Joan trampling an English soldier. This is the militant Joan in some of the versions of Joan you'll see. Here's a bust of Joan, more pious. I love the 2 tones. Plus, there's a nice brooch that I would wear. And then down there at the bottom, on the side of a mantle clock, is a detailed image of Joan being captured at Copena. I mean, it just looks like chaos, and they put it on a clock. And my favorite is the Joan of Arc letter opener, and that's for when you need absolute precision. The Cardinal donated his collection to the Boston Public Library, and he had inspirations to write his own book on Joan, but he passed away before he could. And I bring up the Cardinal to emphasize a point, and this is somewhat hyperbole. A person can spend a lifetime studying Joan and her impact over the past 600 years, and they would never finish. Just consider that Wright rose to the position of cardinal in the Catholic Church, enabling him to travel often and interact with other collectors and curators of art and books. With friends in high places and parishioners surely eager to please, he could be a focal point for others and their encounters with Joan. Very few of us will live a life like that in adventure to collect as much Joan of Arc paraphernalia as possible. And the Cardinal's collection was far from complete, and he never got to finish working with it. And you never will be finished with this, because there are some pieces you can't collect. For example, let's talk about the earliest visual depiction of Joan of Arc. It was made by someone who hadn't even seen her yet. There was a clerk in the Parliament of Paris who recorded sessions between 1417 and 1435. Most of his records are procedural and boring, but they also include hot news that would reach Paris. And when it came to the news that the siege of Orleans had suddenly ended, he never mentioned Joan by name. Instead, he described a pucelle in the enemy ranks, and we'll get back to that phrase, carrying a banner. And in the margin, he drew a girl with a standard and sword. The girl is also depicted in a dress with long hair, as opposed to armor and short hair that Joan would have sported on the battlefield. And let's talk about the phrase pucelle quickly. This is one of the concepts that doesn't translate well outside of medieval France. In English, it translates to virgin. And most English works often translate pucelle to maid. So you often see Joan referred to as Joan the Maid or the Maid of Orleans. But let's go back to pucelle, because this is a glimpse in how she carved her path Women in medieval France had few roles. Young women were pucelles, meaning they weren't married yet. Then the next role would be wife and mother. Finally, it could be widow. The only other option was none. And I mean N-U-N, not like N-O-N-E, but none. Um, but Joan referred to herself as La Pucelle, which is the virgin. And this was Joan referring to a known prophecy that one day a Pucelle would restore the kingdom of France, which had currently been at war with England for decades at this point and losing territory. And friends, this won over some doubters. But back to the clerk, who was no artist and rarely doodled like this. He was clearly struck by the notion of a girl in combat calling herself La Pucelle. And while the Parisian clerk provided the oldest surviving visual depiction, Christine de Pizan provided the earliest creative writing later that year in her poem, The Tale of Joan of Arc. Keeping with the notion of La Pucelle, I've quoted this spot. Pizan seizes on three different prophets to tell us, quote, but it was found in histories that she was destined to accomplish her mission. For more than 500 years ago, Merlin, yes, that Merlin, the Sibyl and Bade foresaw her coming, entered her into their writings as someone who would put an end to France's troubles, made prophecies about her, saying that she would carry the banner of France, banner in French wars, and describing all that she would achieve. Now, Pizan exaggerates, but that's her artistic license. This is a much longer poem, highly worth reading. This was definitely propaganda at its finest, and it's a superb read on Joan of Arc. Pizan was another trailblazer, by the way. She had far more privilege than Joan did in her life, but when Pizan became a widow with three children, she found her path through writing. The image here is actually from one of her books on how to conduct warfare. Other early depictions of Joan came in the form of chronicles. There are several of in the chronicles of Charles VII. Here's Joan chasing some sex workers out of the military camp. Several eyewitnesses attested to how Joan sought to keep these women out as she believed they corrupted the soldiers. Another image from the same chronicle depicts the capture of Joan outside of Compiègne. Here's another image of Joan from a different chronicle. This one's an etching, suited up in armor with long hair. Now I'm going to pause here because to take y'all through every depiction of Joan just isn't feasible. Again, I like to try to some means of quantifying. And that's where I turn to one of my favorite turn of the century books, Joan of Arc, according to the sculptors, engravers, and painters. This is a massive book, family size. Actually, I have it next to me. I don't know if you can see me on here. It's big, like a Bible, family Bible size here. I use this book often because it shows a snapshot of known depictions of Joan at the time. It's not everything, but it shows the hot ones. And it's got over 266 images in many mediums, etchings, engravings, drawings, miniatures, paintings, statues, reliefs, medallions, and stained glass windows, all going back to the 15th century. And across all the depictions of Joan in this book, 1 in 5 shows her on horseback or preparing to get on a horse. For example, y'all may have seen this painting of Joan entering Orleans from the 19th century. And since you've seen a few images of Joan on horseback, it's worth emphasizing that a woman straddling a horse, as opposed to riding side saddle, was an uncommon scene in the 15th century. And while there were plenty of discussions about whether this was appropriate at the time, riding a horse tended to be the least of Joan's offenses compared to participating in war, not covering her head, wearing men's clothing, and claiming to be sent by God. And equestrian statues of Joan rose in numbers in the 19th century and continue to proliferate today. For example, one survey of such statues in 1915 counted 14 worldwide. Today, there are at least 3 dozen. The one in New Orleans is very recent. And some of you may have seen this mode by Emmanuel Frimaire. More exist in places like Portland and even Australia. And that brings me to the Joan of Arc Festival in Orleans. It's a week-long celebration held each year to commemorate Joan of Arc's participation in the siege there in 1429. Yearly celebrations began in Orleans in 1430 and continued with only a brief interruption during the French Revolution. The festival is massive, with tens of thousands participating. Each year, a new person is selected to play the titular role. There are ceremonies involving the announcement of who's going to play Joan, who's going to play the king, and the press always covers it. As part of the festival, there is a massive parade that includes people dressed in period garbs and even the military marches. And all of this is to emphasize that Joan of Arc was a well known figure these past 600 years. I saw reports of this festival in the New York Times in the 1910s and 1920s. And Joan's equestrian image was available in numerous mediums. And that brings me to the suffragists. And one of the earliest suffragists inspired by Joan of Arc was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And if you're not familiar with her name, it would be because she's often overshadowed by Susan B. Anthony on the right here. Stanton was a staunch abolitionist and suffragist, and at a keynote address in 1848, after a full-throated proclamation demanding equal rights and the right to vote, Stanton told the audience, "Now is the time for women of this country, if they would save our free institutions, to defend the right, to buckle on the armor that can best resist the keenest weapons of the enemy, contempt and ridicule. The same religious enthusiasm that nerved Joan of Arc to her work nerves us to ours." That's just a fiery speech. Let me give you another example. Consider the work of Sarah Moore Grimke. Born to a slaveholding family, Grimke struggled to enjoy some of the same rights as her brothers to do things like learn Latin. French was okay. She became radicalized when she encountered a group of Quakers that won her over to fighting against the ills of slavery. She also believed that women should have the right to vote and learn whatever damn language they wanted to learn. Grimke later translated a biography of Joan from French, which ended with the proclamation, "Joan of Arc was dead, but France was saved." And the suffragist movements continued to gain steam, or as the suffragist movements continued to gain steam in the US and in England over the decades, various groups formed locally and nationally. And while Joan of Arc was a well-known figure in history, she was in the news more often at this time because of a 51-year effort to see her canonized by the Catholic Church. And there are only a few highlights here, but in this period, there were multiple false starts, delays, and debates on the next steps with Joan. There were also 4 different popes and a conflict between France and the Catholic Church over the separation of church and state. Each year would bring new news on the status of trying to make Joan a saint, including church investigations, arguments made for and against by church officials, and general opinion pieces by world leaders and newspapers. While there had been general interest in Joan since her death, the interest in Joan during this 51 period was amped up. But let's focus on some of the English suffragists, especially as they relate to Joan of Arc. This is a killer crew. In 1909, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence was arrested in an attempt to present a suffrage petition to the Prime Minister. Upon her release, she gave a speech in which she said, "We only have to think of Joan of Arc again, how she was put to death as a criminal, and for many years the stigma of the criminal's execution was upon her and her family. And now today, the church is making her a saint. She had to wait 400 years for her justification. Don't you see that if you are fighting for the right thing, and if you don't succeed, it is as when they plow back the harvest into the soil in order to enrich it for the harvest to come? It is those who fight in the present who enrich the future." Next there, Mabel Tuke. Didn't find any words by her, but I did find a record of her marching behind the mounted Joan of Arc in a large women's rights procession in 1911. And Emily Davison, well, we'll get to her shortly. But Christabel Pankhurst, who was often the leader of some of these groups, described Joan of Arc as, quote, "our patron saint" and, quote, "the militant woman's ideal." But let's talk about the militant approach of some of these suffragists. After decades of making little to no progress in gaining the vote, there were debates on how to get the attention of politicians and men. In addition to marching, you've likely heard that some suffragists chained themselves to buildings, bum rushed politicians with petitions, broke windows, and even set some fires. But recent scholarship has uncovered the scope of these tactics, which was orchestrated by Christabel Pankhurst and her lieutenants, many of which were in the Women's Social and Political Union, WSP for short. Their motto was deeds, not words. And British historian Fern Riddell has found that the WSPU eventually evolved into the most dangerous terrorist organization operating in the United Kingdom at this time, conducting the largest bombing and arson campaign in our entire history. In May 1913 alone, there were 52 bombing and fire attacks. And these were often on mailboxes, but also on cottages and homes of politicians. No one died, not from these attacks, but these were dangerous. And this did get attention. Suffragists and their supporters were split on the tactics, but let's talk about a tactic that garnered attention and was less dangerous. And that's suiting up a woman as Joan of Arc and marching her in suffragist parades. This is Elise Howie. And I'm going to give a trigger warning. We're going to talk about women on hunger strikes and being force fed, and it is not pretty. So heads up on that. This is Elise Howie dressed as Joan of Arc, leading a procession to celebrate the release of some imprisoned suffragists. Howie was full of grit, that's how I describe her. At the time of this photo, she'd already been arrested on several occasions for setting off fire alarms, breaking windows, and assaulting politicians. Howie was jailed at least 6 times, and she was committed to hunger strikes while imprisoned. The force feeding she endured caused injuries to her throat that took at one point 4 months to heal. And I'll just briefly explain force feeding for those who aren't familiar. They would literally hold you down, hold your mouth open, put a hose down your throat, and pour food down it. This was typically milk and eggs. And the methods to hold you down and hold open the mouth varied, but they very painful and often caused injuries. For example, on her last imprisonment, she was released after a force feeding episode knocked out most of her front teeth. In this photo, she's 25 years old, and although she had been arrested prior to this march, she had not endured the worst of it yet. Another portrayal of Joan in these parades was by Marjorie Bryce, an actress. Her story is less gruesome than Howie's, and in this photo, Bryce is 19 years old, which is important because that's the same age Joan was when she was executed. We also believe that this is her sister leading the horse, but we don't have a firm record on it. This was the 1911 women's procession. It was held 1 week before the coronation of George V, and it aimed to win the king over to the support of women's suffrage. It did not. The Joan of Arc and women's suffrage parades quickly spread to the US, where Joan became a regular feature in parades. In New York City, in May 1912, there were 10,000 women marching. And I have some quotes from some newspapers. The Hartford Courant noted that Mary Stuart, who was dressed up as Joan, was, quote, the most conspicuous feature of the parade, and she, quote, wore a suit of shining mail and rode astride a large milk-white horse. One suffragist visiting from Illinois told a newspaper that participating in the parade, quote, gave her a sort of Joan of Arc feeling to be marching along the street to show her allegiance to a cause. And it wasn't just in New York. They had several in Baltimore. And this drawing on the left here, they would reuse this drawing several years in a row to promote parades marching for women's suffrage. But later in 1912, also in New York, they had 20,000 women marching, not just 10. And this one was held at night, started at 8 p.m., and the marchers carried lanterns. And the New York Times described the scene as, quote, a long river of fire. And then elsewhere, they described it as a rolling stream of fiery lava. This was spectacle at its finest. And while Joan did not lead the procession, the Times tells us that when people saw Joan, no one in all of the parade got such a noisy welcome as that accorded to Isabel Rea, who played Joan. The New York Sun tells us, quote, thousands of hands clapped as Joan rode by, astride a white horse Penelope in crimson plush, wearing glittering armor and carrying a long sword. Now, Joan of Arc rode with the Joan of Arc Suffrage League, and carrying the group's flag was Nellie B. Van Slingerland. A few things worth noting here. First, Slingerland is a killer name. Second, that hat dominates. Third, this photo is not from the parade, but I wanted to make sure you had a visual for her. Slingerland started the Joan of Arc Suffrage League in 1909, and this was one of countless groups throughout the United States that toiled for the right to vote. In a 1909 interview, Slingerland explained, I had never been a suffragist before, but I am now. You have to get justice. The United States is not going to be fit to live in unless there is change. We're going to have a very nice club of ladies and gentlemen, as Jeanne d'Arc in her work was surrounded by men, and we believe in having men in our club. But all these parades would pale in comparison to the women's suffrage procession in Washington, set to take place the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Wilson would not support suffrage, and the women determined to steal the show from his inauguration. Suffragist organizations spent months planning for this moment, and the order of the parade was meticulously set out. And I'm going to start moving this. You could see this was a drawing at the time that they showed some of the order. Joan's in the front, and then it kind of shows how they were trying to lay it out and where they would be walking by in the various spots of Washington. Um, and the order procession here, it's important because while this we may look at this and think this is a righteous cause for suffrage, there were other issues at play here. What this procession chart does not show is that many of the women marched together in groups from their respective states. However, African American women had to fight to participate in the march at all, and at the last minute, they were asked to march in the back of the parade. While some of these women obliged, Ida B. Wells and others did not. Wells stayed on the sidelines until the Illinois contingent approached. She and others then joined the parade in front of her state's group. There were reports of at least 40 other Black women marching with their respective states during the parade. But as it relates to Joan of Arc, Ida B. Wells would spend decades being compared to the teenage warrior, but initially because of her efforts to combat lynching, not for women's suffrage. Phrases such as the Black Joan of Arc were common. And I'm going to read a poem from 1894. Forgive some of the very outdated language, but it reads, Joan of Arc for the French and Ida B. Wells for the Negro. Go on, brave woman leader, spread our wrongs from shore to shore, until clothed with his rights is the Negro, and lynchings are no more. And the wise Afro-American mother, who her children of heroines tell, shall speak in tones of gratitude the name of Ida B. Wells. So I read all that because I'm also not going to hide from the irony of a Black man who is escorting Joan of Arc, while there is a Black woman in the parade who had been compared to Joan of Arc years before the 1913 procession in D.C. And Wells's determination to march with the women of her state demonstrates why she was compared to Joan of Arc, as both women carved their own paths in worlds that sought to exclude them. The DC procession was rough going. Several 100,000 onlookers arrived. In fact, when Woodrow Wilson arrived on his train that day, he wondered why no one was greeting him. It was because they were at the women's suffragist parade. There were men around that began harassing, jeering, blocking the parade, attacking the women. Cops reportedly stood by and watched. Although some of the women fled, others locked arms and continued forward, but they were blocked. The procession could not finish until the army arrived to clear the crowd. And through all this, Joan of Arc continued to garner attention. And one newspaper described, quote, that modern Joan of Arc, the herald beautiful, who sat splendidly on her magnificent mount of pure white, at times dispersing what in spite of police protection might have been a noisy rabble, which, however, gave way at the sight of this majestic apparition. Now, I want to take us back across the pond, and I want to visit Emily Davison, who I skipped earlier. She's in the back there. Davison is 37 years old in this photo where she's being arrested. She was among the suffragists who believed that more militant action was necessary if they were ever going to gain the right to vote. Some of her known violations including assaulting police officers, throwing rocks at politicians' cars, breaking into the House of Commons while it was in session, burning mailboxes, and bombing the cottage of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And that's basically the Secretary of Treasury in America, the equivalent here. Her last arrest was for whipping a Baptist minister, but in her defense, she only attacked him because she thought he was the prime minister. During her multiple arrests, Davison went on hunger strikes 7 times and was force-fed 49 times. She was even force-fed when she wasn't on a hunger strike. In 1912, it was so bad for the women in Holloway Prison, Davison determined to jump to her death with the goal of sacrificing herself and bringing attention to the cruel treatment of her and her fellow prisoners. She dove headfirst from a height of about 30 feet, lived, and cracked 2 vertebrae. She was force-fed a few days later. Davison's tactics eventually got her expelled from many of the suffragist groups who disavowed her. Which brings us to the Epsom Derby in 1913. There, Davison determined to rush out onto the track and was trampled and knocked out. She was operated on 2 days later, never regained consciousness, and died. We don't know what her plan was exactly. Was she just causing a spectacle? She had some suffragist flags with her, so there are some theories that she wanted to attach one of these to a horse. There are also theories that she was just trying to die in the most public way possible to gain attention. We don't know for sure. But Davison became recognized as, and this is quoting one of the newspapers, the first martyr of the women's suffragist movement. At her funeral procession, a statue of Joan of Arc was adorned with a message in honor and in loving and revered memory of Emily Wilding Davison. She died for women. And from there, Davison was continually compared to Joan of Arc. And the Women's Social and Political Union, the same group that Davison was kicked out of eventually, continued to seize on the image of Joan of Arc, placing her on posters, reports, and newspapers. And Joan continued to march in their parades. But there were bigger events on the horizon, namely World War I. And the war is important here because as the war continued, Joan of Arc marching in a parade was still very popular, and it soon became a symbol of patriotism, appearing on posters and in parades. And there are some major events that we can highlight in the story here. For example, 1918, the Representation of the People Act brought suffrage to British women over the age of 30 if they or their husbands owned property. 10 years later, the right to vote was expanded to all women over the age of 21, regardless of property ownership or marital status. And in 1920, the same year the Catholic Church deemed Joan of Arc a saint, the United States ratified the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. But the fight was far from over, as many of the state constitutions still prevented African Americans and other minorities from voting. There's plenty to discuss here, and I hope you appreciate that I've barely scratched the surface in the fight for equal rights in this era, or in our own. We've talked about voting, but we haven't talked about any other right that these women were also fighting for. And I barely touched on racial equality in the fight against lynching. My goal has been to demonstrate how Joan of Arc was an inspiration to these women, fighting, winning, losing, and sometimes dying for these rights. But I want to jump to the present. I've already shared about how Orleans hosts its yearly Joan of Arc festival in France. But I want to talk about a group closer to us in New Orleans. There exists the Crew de Jeanne d'Arc. For those of you unfamiliar, a crew is a social club of sorts that organizes parades, very often in Mardi Gras. And there's no better place for a parade than New Orleans. And the Crew de Jeanne d'Arc was founded in 2008, hosting their parade on January 6th, their traditional birthday of Joan of Arc. And they have been inspired by their sister city in France, and each year they host ceremonies to select new people to play the star roles, such as the King and, of course, Joan. I had the pleasure of meeting these folks last year, and I learned that playing the role of Joan of Arc is a big deal. The Rotary clubs of both Orleans and New Orleans have established an exchange program of sorts, where each Joan visits the other country for a week during the events in January and in May. Marley Marsalis, seen here, shared her experience in France, where she ate at banquets, visited museums, marched in the parade, met the mayor of Orleans, and then visited Paris to see preparation for the Olympics last summer. Participants in the parade spend all year working on costumes. The parade continues to grow in size, and the current estimate for 2025 was over 600 people marching. And 2025 introduced a new section of the parade, the suffragists. That's right, this is not 1912, this is 2025, and these women are mimicking those who marched more than 100 years prior. Their banner features two of the Joans we saw earlier, Inez Milholland and Marjorie Bryce. As they march, they hand out yellow flowers and pamphlets telling the story of the suffragists. As a suffragist of the early 20th century, employed an equestrian Joan of Arc for inspiration and attention, today, these Joan of Arc enthusiasts employ suffragists for the same purposes. These women have managed to expand the theme of the Croix de Jeanne d'Arc and create a spectacle within the parade. They are not medieval. They are our great great grandparents bringing a scene closer to home for spectators. And I'll finish there. My goal was to relieve some cabin fever by talking about Joan inspiring art, writing, and the suffragist movement. For my own part, preparing this presentation has been an inspiration for me. I've always been struck by the courage and audacity of Joan of Arc, but I'm also heartbroken by the tragedy of Emily Davison and humbled by the grit and determination of Ida B. Wells. I hope this encourages you to explore their stories more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. What you just said, it reminds me there was a movie called Suffragette that came out not super long ago, that did show what Emily did, which was very moving. And it was great that you could talk about her. So then I was like, oh, that's who that was in the movie. And so just a little more background story was great.